Hey everyone, and welcome to another book club where I take game development related books. This time it's the Game Design Toolbox by Martin Annander and talk about some of my key lessons for it. At the end of the video I'll give you some of my general thoughts as well. So why this book? I think that's an important one to start with. I'm a bad game designer. I'm gonna just go out and call it. I'm by no means a naturally gifted designer. Sometimes I talk to people who are like way longer in the industry and they're like, yeah, when I was 12 years old, I was making my own board games or like play pretend games or something with my people. And it's a natural evolution for going into game design. However, I was the core game designer, whatever it may mean if you're a 3 or 4 person team, for Forge Industry. And I dropped the ball plenty of times because it was my first game. And now I did the same thing honestly with Songs of Everjade. Once again, I was the core game designer, and once again, I dropped the ball too many times. I ended up killing the project, and now I'm working on the third project, basically, Guild Architect, and you guys have, in the footage that we've shown so far, or in our coding streams, have, rightfully so, called us out and been like, hey guys, I don't see how this makes sense game design-wise and whatever. So I set out on a quest using this book to become a better game designer. I've got some other plans as well that I'll talk about in later videos, but I just wanted to know, how do I become a better game designer? And what I really liked about this book, which is why I originally reached out to Martin, by the way, I did not pay for this. He sent me the book over for a copy, but that's everything really that there needs to be known, is this is not some dense book like, for example, Level Up, which is also a book talking about game design. The problem is, this is dense. This is something where you need to actually sit down and take a full like notebook, treat it like a textbook basically. Whereas what I really like here is it's a pretty small book, but it's actually really valuable in that in like every 1 or 2 pages, like this is one single tip. And then if you go to the next page, it's another single tip. I don't know which ones I actually pulled up right now, but I really like this because it's a bite-sized approach to game design. Whereas this, I could kill a man with this and I would not even, like this book would not even be dented. This is a different approach to game design. And sure, both have their merits probably. I want to focus purely on this one now. And how am I going to do that? Well, I'm going to be sharing 7 different pieces of the Game Design Toolbox, like my top tips basically from the book. There's a lot more in it. I think like more like 70 probably. So I'm not spoiling that much for you. Sharing some of my favorites and also talking then about like, hey, how have I maybe applied them for Forge Industry, for Guild Architect and all of those games basically. And the first tip, and some of these are going to sound extremely painfully obvious to some people, but some people need to hear this. The first one is just try it. So what does that mean? I often talk to you game developers and you've been working on this certain idea or this certain mechanic for like months where you're like thinking about it before you go to sleep. You've got your little notebooks filled with like notes of this is how my dream game is going to look. And you've got all of these really cool ideas, but you've never actually tried it. And it's not just when you're starting, but also when you're already developing on the game where it's like the, wouldn't it be cool if we added this or whatever, which, you know, scope creep, whatever. But instead of just thinking about it and psyching each other up, try it. That should be your default response. Maybe don't put it immediately into the full game, but doing things like rapid prototyping, quickly throwing together something where it's just some Unity beans basically moving around in a world, for example, is so important to do. And it's going to give you much more information just endlessly being like, maybe the mechanic should do this, no, maybe it should this, like keep flip-flopping around. Just go out and do it and see if it works, and if it does, you can turn it into your game. If it doesn't work, well, you've at least tried it and you can move on with that information. And then the second piece of advice the book has is assume less. And what this means is basically a response to the, oh, you're talking about a game design idea with someone and they're like, I don't think this would work, or I don't think people would be interested in that, where you make assumptions about your player that honestly are just based off your feelings and your emotions, and you realistically don't have actual solid backing up of why it wouldn't work. You should be really vigilant in general of using anecdotal evidence. And it's something that we in our studio have struggled with as well, because some of our conversations are, to give you some context, me and Thomas, we aren't the most hardcore gamers. Like we play some games, but it pales in comparison to William, who has like a gazillion games on Steam and has played everything under the sun basically, where often we're at this impasse where I want a certain mechanic in the game and it gets shut down by William because he's like, no, this wouldn't work because this game doesn't have it and they use this thing instead. It can be very easy to be like, okay, you've got more gameplay experience, sure, I'll listen to you, but it's not always the best approach because William is still one person with his own preferences and things like that. And it is something you need to watch out for. Just because some game does something as well, you don't automatically have to do that as well. That's also part of the assumption of like, hey, this game uses R as their reload button for a shooter game, for example, so every game must use it. At some points, yes, you should stick to those standards, but depending on the game, you can definitely still break free from that. Something like a cruelty squad, where being batshit insane is part of the game design, it makes sense to not stick to that default thing and just be like, hey, we're now going to reload using our mouse instead, because fuck you, because that's what the developer thought probably when he was developing the game. And it worked because they did still have the design idea and they didn't look at what other games were doing and be like, oh, this wouldn't work because XYZ game does it completely different than ours and they're more successful than us. So don't assume everything. Once again, try it, prototype it, validate it as well, but don't shoot down ideas just because some other game has done it a different way, basically. I think one more example that I quickly want to give for this is the idea that automation games must have conveyor belts to transport items. I think looking back, we did kind of a good job there with our like design and our gameplay hook, where we were like, what if we didn't have the conveyor belts? Who says you actually need to have conveyor belts for an automation game? Why can't we just let people carry it around? And how does that influence the game mechanics? So we did that. And I think for quite some time, we were pretty much in a unique bubble where that was one of our core separators, basically. By now, some other games have jumped onto that idea as well, like the Oddsparks and Automation Adventure, but definitely it's not because Factorio and Satisfactory use conveyor belts that every single automation game has to use conveyor belts. Then the next piece of advice is once you're actually planning on starting to implement certain pieces of mechanics. And this is something that we're actively doing before I actually read the book with Guild Architect already. And that is to pretend to play the game, where I sometimes have big grand ideas for certain mechanics and certain pieces of UI, but it takes a relatively long time to create a UI, make sure the UX is solid, actually implement the underlying code mechanics. And once again, you can't always know, is this going to work or how is this going to work? And something good to do here is just to pretend, what am I actually going to be doing here? This is something that Thomas often does with me because I come up with the idea, Thomas does the implementation often, and he wants me to correctly, and that's his right as the developer, he should know what I want. But I sometimes also don't fully know yet what I want, so how do we figure that out? I describe, this is how I would just do it. I would press this button, then this menu would show up. I have different pieces of information on the table. I have a card and I can stamp it. I can inspect the certain cards. Like I talk about the entire thing of how would this work before we actually put it in the game yet. Just walk through the entire thing, basically have like a mini D&D session of your specific game mechanic where one person just explains how should this work, and then the other person, Thomas in my case, just pokes holes into it and be like, this wouldn't work, what about this, what about this? What have you thought about this edge case? What if I have no gold? All of those things basically. And then once we come to a consensus and he can actually talk to me about, hey, this is actually what I'm supposed to be doing, that's when I know, okay, it's clear, I can write out the entire requirement basically and get working on actually implementing the code now and actually writing the entire game mechanics. So that's something as well. Don't just have it in your head and implement it if you're a solo developer. Even if you're a solo developer, you can pretend to play it out. This is something as well why I like board games and I like dabbled a little bit in making my own, because you can very easily on the fly also just change the rules. Be like, hey, this mechanic from now on doesn't make sense actually because we're playing it out right now. Let's change it and see how that goes. So you can go really fast with that. It's not really fully related to this thing, but board games are a great way in general just to iterate on game design. And then a piece of advice as well that is linked to this of like say it all out is once you're making that description basically of what you want to do, make a checklist for every single thing that is possible, for every single thing that can be done. So maybe have a list of all the different activities that I could do if I'm in that quest creation screen, because it's not just, oh, I have to stamp. No, I can open the books or I can click my little bell and everything I've thrown off the table magically flies back. Make an in-depth list of every single thing basically that would need to be able to be done in a certain step. The book also has the example of a card game basically, where it's like, okay, it's my turn. what are all the things I can do? I can draw cards, I can put down cards, I can use tokens or whatever. List all of those out so you know, once again, checklist wise. Checklists are great, honestly, for figuring out, is everything implemented? Is this what I wanted? Am I missing something? What are the other activities I could be doing? Write all of those out as well and have them as part of your game, basically. Then this next one is one that I talked about previously with Crisostomo, who used the analogy of steak and ice cream, but Martin also uses it and he calls it the sausage cake, where you do not always want to mix certain things together. Like, so you can like steak and you can like ice cream, or you can like cake and you can like sausage. But that doesn't mean that if you take the cake and the sausage and you blend it together and you make this basically disgusting looking cake, that should be your game design. You shouldn't look at, okay, open world like survival games are performing really well on Steam, and co-op games and survivor likes and whatever else. Let me take all of the top selling genres and just mash them into one big game and I should be rich, right? That's not how it works. You're much better off focusing on one specific genre and sticking to it and trying to get as close to perfection as you can with that. And maybe you can loan like a little few mechanics from certain other genres, but don't just add two genres together. It's something that you do see with like the survivor likes, and suddenly there's like an automation survivor like, and suddenly there's a survivor like with base building or whatever. That is also an approach, but it's something to get wrong very easily. The only reason that those like automation survivor likes work is because they're very fast at their time to market, basically. And they can overlook part of their game design by just being the first person to offer that and having that as their unique factor, where they're the first to combine those two genres. That does not constitute for this is ideal game design. So really don't just throw a bunch of genres together, look at the top sellers on Steam, or like 4X, for example, and be like, I'm gonna make a 4X survival game. No, that's not going to work. That's not what your audience wants either. 4X people want 4X games, survivor-like people want survivor-like games. Don't give a 4X game to a person who likes survivor-likes, because most of the time they will not want to eat your cake. Then another piece of advice that we've been using as well with Guild Architect, I can't fully think of an example, but I know we've done this, is leaving things behind. You start off with so many great ideas and maybe you've already implemented them and they work acceptable, but combining them with other mechanics, for example, it just doesn't feel like it's really working. Oh, one example here is in our guild, we wanted to have two different kinds of people. We wanted to have adventurers and like commoners, basically, where there would be a distinction between the two. Like the adventurers could go out and party, the commoners were just there for money. But we were just running into too many operational things and we were like, actually, can we just replace the commoners with more adventurers, and wouldn't that just work just as well and save us a lot of headache and make it more cohesive? Turns out the answer to that question is yes, so we did that. So don't be scared sometimes to see if I take away something, especially if it's causing you a lot of trouble or it's a mechanic that doesn't really integrate with the rest of the game. See, does it give a big impact if I just get rid of it? Poof, it's gone. And maybe your game design may actually be better. Once again, you shouldn't just eternally pile on to like more features and use that as your constitution for good game design. That's the feedback we got as well when we talked about, oh, we have these mini games. Don't just pile needless shit on top of your game when the core of your game isn't even fully there yet. Then just look at, okay, let me take some of the things away, focus on the core and see how much of an impact is this going to have. Then a very, very basic one that I can cover in like 10 seconds, basically, tween more. Tweening is going to be like a mix of game design and game feel. It's part of the book as well, where you just want to make things ease in, ease out. Don't just have things poof appear on the screen. Let them slowly appear, or like let the window increase in size and like just appear like that. Don't just be like frame 1 to frame 2. Suddenly there's a whole new UI element. This is something that makes Hearthstone feel so good as well. They only started making the rest of Hearthstone basically once they got the card placement and how you interact with the game design-wise and UX-wise. Once they had nailed that, then they only started working on the rest of the game. So it is very important, and just by putting tweens on everything, it's super easy. There's assets for it on Unity, I know, and probably for the other engines as well. Put tweens on everything you can. It's advice I've gotten from other game developers as well. It just makes your game feel so much nicer, and it's a pretty easy win. And then this last one I kept because it doesn't really feel like game design. This is something that I think a lot of developers forget as well, that part of your game design is also just what is the game I'm making and how am I pitching it. If you're making a game and you meet me at a conference. I always ask you this, by the way, if you're gonna ever meet me at a conference, we're heading to Gamescom, I'm gonna ask you, give me your 2-sentence pitch for the game. And if you're like fumbling it, I'm gonna roast the shit out of you right there. So you should always have that 2-sentence pitch of your game, because if you don't know the game you're making, how are you going to have good game design when you don't have a good, short, clear description of this is what the game's gonna be about? And don't get me wrong, I know it can be really hard to put into words your genius idea, and it's not something that's just gonna come to you out of nowhere. It's something that actually takes a little bit of effort. How we did it for Guild Architect, because we also didn't know for the longest time, is we just created like a collaborative Google Doc for our entire team basically. And we sat together in a call, you can do this solo as well. And I just wrote down a shitty short description basically of the game, like 2 sentences. And it's much easier once you've just written that first one to just iterate on top of that and talk about like, hey, I like this part, I don't like this part, let's keep going and then see, does this fit the game? Is this what we want to go for? Does this give the marketing vibe as well? Or if you want to pitch it to someone, do you really sell the game's design, the game's vision through it? Once again, it doesn't maybe sound like game design, but trust me, this is one of the core parts. Like, your game design has pillars, it has different kinds of hooks as well. Your marketing is ingrained as part of the design as well. It's not just having an awesome game idea that's game design, it's also being able to effectively communicate what is that game idea about. So in summary, what do I think of the book? I liked it. I really liked just how actionable it is. And I do actually prefer it over the Level Up book if you're if you're not like a brand new beginner. If you've got a prototype, if you're already working on something and you're not starting from scratch, this book is going to help you more, I think, in a much more condensed format. Like, you can go through this in like 1 or 2 days basically. And for every page, which at the end of the day is a pretty specific game design tip already, you can just immediately apply it to your game or your future game. The book is divided, actually, I didn't talk about this before, into different phases: ideation, exploration, the commitment, problem solving, like basically like the balancing and things like that. All of those are parts of game design, and you can just take this book whether you're thinking about, I want to get started with the game, which is the ideation phase, versus, okay, I'm like midway through development. Let me take this and put it next to my game and see how am I going to improve my game's design. And it's really actionable. There's a lot of good tips in here. So I do recommend this book. I mean, I reached out to the guy because this book seemed interesting. So of course I was gonna be a bit biased. I probably won't be doing any bad books on the book club series here. Anyways, I'm curious, what is your top game design tip? Do you have any that I should implement for Guild Architect? I really want to know. Leave those in the comments down below. Apart from that, if you're new here, we make game development videos 2 times every week. So if that's something that you're interested in general, be sure to head down below and subscribe as well, as it just simply makes me happy, because I like to see the number go up and it gives me more clout to reach out to other book publishers and be like, hey, send me a copy and I can make videos about the books. That's all I really had to say. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you guys in the next one. Bye!